Dan Carlin, welcome to the Game Informer Show, sir.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people watching and listening to this, the first question is, what is Dan Carlin doing on a video game podcast? What's going on here?
Well, I don't know why I shouldn't be. I mean, the reason I got my first personal computer in my life was for a video war game, so I think I'm the perfect person to be talking to.
I love it. What was that game?
It was called Sun Tzu: The Art of War.
Oh, interesting.
1980s, MS-DOS, simple rock, paper, scissors sort of setup, and I had to have it.
And how was it?
It was awesome. It was the funny thing is that it wouldn't keep your attention for 2 seconds now, but at the time I couldn't work the computer in any other respect, but I could turn that game on and play it. So I probably logged in hundreds of hours in that thing.
Oh, wow. Do you keep up with war games or video games in general?
It depends. I have certain genres that are kind of right up my alley. They're the kind of things that are not generally the mass-produced sort of stuff. So when something comes out that I'm into, somehow it usually finds its way to me.
Okay, yeah. It seems like you'd be like a Civilization type of guy. Have you ever dabbled in that series?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And but I mean the stuff that when I get into something like there's a version of an old Paradox Hearts of Iron game that I play, and it was a mod, of course, because it has to be super realistic and historical for me, but it's so old that I have to keep this old outdated computer sitting in my office eating up space for no other reason than to play that game when I'm in the mood.
There are a lot of people out there like you. It's a common thing that keep the old computers just to play old war games. Like there's really a lot of these folks.
Am I the only person that thinks there is an open market for somebody to create just like a PlayStation type console that does nothing but play your old computer games for you?
That's interesting. Oh, they have this whole trend of kind of like, Super Nintendo classics, PlayStation minis, stuff like that. I think they could definitely do that with PCs, right? Just have a box, have it smaller, have it look like an older PC, and it just comes bundled with all this old software that's just nearly impossible to get up and running these days.
Well, I'm sorry it came out now, if that's the truth, because my daughter just cleaned out my office the other day and must have tossed out 75 old, CD-based war games that I just haven't been able to play in years. I don't know why I keep them around, but, on the hopes that maybe this is going to be invented and I could play them all again. I'd probably be disappointed when you think of how much has changed and how much we probably romanticized how good they were.
Oh, yeah. Don't go back. I don't know if I have to tell you this, Dan Carlin, but don't look back to the past. It's not great.
Deal.
Okay. Do you have a favorite game of all time?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to say no because I think I waver on this. The game I just mentioned, the old Paradox mod game, is a fun one, but I go back and forth. No, the answer to that's no. I'm waiting on the next great game is the way I look at it.
All right, that's fair. Can you... it ties into games, but also I guess everything else in general. Can you just sit back and enjoy any sort of historical game or even TV show, or do you always have your critical history lens absorbing all media?
The latter. Yeah. I'm definitely trying as much as I can because I realize that the market forces and all the things involved. But no, I can't. When I watch these things, there's an inherent. I'm worse than that too, especially when it comes to things like movies and stuff, because my folks were in that business, and somehow it destroys your ability to suspend disbelief. And so you always are able to notice the little things on the set and all that stuff. So I'm hypercritical, and it ruins everything.
I'm so sorry. When it comes to like history and video games, there's definitely a bunch of war games out there. Battlefield, I'm sure will come up later in this interview as well. But there's one that's kind of the tentpole, which is the Assassin's Creed series, where in that series you're in some sci-fi device that lets you basically jump back between any time. Have you ever seen anything about those games or heard anything?
Generally, the kind of games that I'm not into are the first-person experience games.
Yeah.
So for me, I want to be a general, or I want to be running an empire, or I want to be on the field where I'm controlling several different tactical units. I don't want to be the guy carrying the pistol, diving from foxhole to foxhole. So usually, those kind of games I'm not playing.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I've never been into the first-person shooter kind of thing.
Yeah, it's tough. And sometimes they try and convey like a sense of scale. Like Battlefield 1 was a big game from, 3-4 years ago at this point, maybe. And that had a really interesting opening. It was all taking place during World War I. And it opens just in this fucked up battle. And every time you die as the player character, it'll actually put the name of a real soldier that died in the battle on the screen, and then it'll jump you to a different person in that battle. And so you're jumping around and seeing all these different people's perspectives as you're living through their deaths. And it kind of, I guess, ties into that larger theme, which is nice to have a sense of scale of just how many people went down in this one small battle here.
Yeah, I mean, from an artistic standpoint, I kind of like that approach. I wasn't aware of that. I think that sounds kind of cool, actually.
Yeah. Well, now you're kind of designing a little bit of a video game here with War Remains.
Yeah, the thing about this is it's actually focused on if somebody came to you and said, let's build something you want to play with, or specifically, I mean, I feel like I was in a position where somebody said, we have this technology, what would you like to do with it? And I thought, well, what would I like to go through? And that was kind of how the whole thing sort of germinated. I mean, this is an experience we built for me, and you guys might be able to have fun in it too. That's how I look at it.
Okay, so yeah, that first conversation, did they pitch you on setting it during World War I, or are you still just fascinated by that era?
No, a friend of mine introduced me to VR a while back, and so it was sort of in the ground had been fertilized for that. And then I made a friend with a company, and they work in immersive virtual reality and augmented reality kind of things. And he sort of said, would you ever be interested in doing anything in this medium? And I said, yeah, I'm kind of interested in the medium, blah, blah, blah. And so he said, well, why don't you sit down and just write a story that would be like, if you could do anything, what would it be? And we started from that. And I mean, originally this was we were going to make like a home product or something. So many evolutions later, we end up with what we have in War Remains, which is a World War I scene where a bunch of it takes place in the trench.
And so researching this thing a little bit, it seems wild because the whole idea is it's like an installation thing, right? Is it in Austin? Is that right?
Yeah, and that came because we were having problems. You know, we talked earlier about video games and my inability to get past the realism stuff and all that. Well, there are limitations, as you might expect in any home environment. You can't control the environment. And so eventually, when you want a certain level of realism, you're really asking for things like mammoth speakers that you can depend on are going to deliver a certain kind of sound or feel, actually. And you can't control everybody's home environment. So it sort of naturally evolved to a destination VR experience just because of the needs of trying to create a really and when I say realistic, understand this is a kind of negative human experience. And so you don't want to get too real, but in the sense of trying to reach and get close to that line of realism, we sort of required ourselves to control more of your environment than we could do in your house, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Where did you find that line between trying to be real but not too real? What is too real for this depiction here?
We found it in arguments in offices over months and months and months of trying to find that sweet spot, because I'm always pushing for greater levels of realism. But, you know, we were describing it because I grew up, when I was a kid, there was a movie called Jaws, and it's famous, and you guys have all heard of it. But at the time, it was at this interesting sweet spot between, is it so scary that you don't want to go? And they were kind of marketing it that way. And I remember thinking a lot of the same sorts of questions were coming up when we designed this, because the more visceral you make it, the more people you are by default sort of leaving out, right? People who can no longer handle the experience. And yet there's a certain, I don't want to call it coolness factor, because we're talking about people's lives and deaths and all, but I mean, somehow the more intense and real you make it, though, the more there's this attraction where people are curious. I mean, combat itself is one of those things where people are innately curious about aspects of it. So when you say we're going to model something that gives you an enhanced sense of what it might be like to be in the situation, I mean, if I said I could put you in the opening scene from Saving Private Ryan and make it feel pretty realistic, that's a horrific circumstance that a lot of the people who went through the real thing would have gladly opted out of if they could have, but we're going to pay some money and buy a ticket and go there. So there's a sweet spot you're looking for between something that's interesting and enjoyable, and when you leave, it leaves you with a lasting experience that you want to reflect back on, and something that's like going, you know, if I promised I could take you back in time to a real life dentist experience from dentistry 200 years ago, you're not going to buy a ticket and go to that. So there's a sweet spot between realism and curiosity that we're trying to reach. And the levels that I can handle are higher than other people's levels. So you got to sort of meet in the middle and find a place where we're not going to actually hurt the person who's going to this thing, but we're not going to shortchange the experience either. I mean, people lived and died in this. If you're telling people you're going to take them through a simulation of that gets a little closer, you have to be sort of faithful to the experience at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. Do you remember any of the wildest pitches that you had? I mean, pumping the smell of actual gas into the room, anything crazy like that was off the table by the end?
Well, I mean, my biggest complaint about this experience is that it's not long enough, right? So I'd like to have you for 2 hours and really damage your psyche in a minor way. But with VR and everything, there's a sweet spot right now of about 15 minutes. And so when you have about 15 minutes to recreate an intense experience like this, you kind of have to, if you'll pardon the pun, pick your battles. What do you want to really do well? And we were looking at what the technology can really do well. And there's certain aspects of the technology involved in War Remains that's already highly developed that most people don't think about. And one of them's sound. Skywalker Labs got involved in this thing, and they're using massive speakers here to recreate elements of the sound in a way that is extremely realistic. The only way we could make it more realistic is to make it louder to the point where it damaged your hearing. Now, that would be more realistic because people came out of this war with damaged hearing. But I guess so one of the battles we tried to pick here was, let's get the sound correct in a number of ways as much as we can, so that when you walk out of here, you have a better sense of what that might be like. So there are a few places where we picked our battles, and when you have Skywalker involved and the ability to create a destination where we can set up the speakers, well, we have massive speakers in the floor and stuff to give you a visceral feel up through your spinal column of some of this stuff. So that's one of the aspects where we erred on the side of more realism and picked our battles.
Right on. So it's like 15 minutes or so, and it's one person at a time is putting on a VR headset and then walking through this installation, and it's just like a trench, it's a battle, and so they can reach out and touch the things because you've actually physically recreated kind of crude versions of these?
That was one of the funny aspects, and we were laughing about it once because there were certain elements of this that reminded us of haunted houses when you were a kid, because there's two sides of this. One is the stuff that's in your headset that you're seeing, the virtual reality stuff that people are accustomed to seeing at their house. But the other is the stuff so that when you reach out in the experience, there's something there to touch. And that's almost like the haunted house thing. And a lot of the guys had Brandon Oldenburg and his team over at oh my God, I'm blanking. Flight School. I'm sorry. I always say Brandon. I never say Flight School. They were sort of enjoying the haunted house aspect of this, where you have, I mean, there are rats in this experience that you'll see in your headset. If you reach out and touch them, there are rats, and they have spinal columns and skeletons. And so there was a bunch of that fun stuff too. So I wouldn't even call it a crude trench. If you took off your headset and looked around, it looks like a pretty good mock-up of a trench, including the barbed wire.
Yeah, that's wild. This doesn't exactly seem like a moneymaker, where it's one person at a time going through this recreation. What's the incentive here?
That is the problem. I mean, the throughput, I think you can get more than one person at a time, but don't quote me on this. But I think when one person is just starting out the experience, another person could be finishing it. But absolutely, I mean, this is when you take something and you say, at least for me, that you're doing something for artistic purposes here. I appreciate the ability to create something new, and that's what these new technologies give us the luxury of. If I was just in this for money, absolutely, you want to create a movie or you want to do something like that. But what I like about podcasting is that it was a blank white space where you could create anything you wanted. I felt the same way about VR. Obviously, they're not letting me have my 2-hour VR experience yet that hurts you, but we're going as far as we can. And I love the idea that I sat down with a white piece of paper one day and directions of write anything you want, and we're going to start the process from there. So for me, would I love it to make money? Of course I would, but you're right. The throughput and everything else makes it much more of an experience that we're doing for, an athlete would say, the love of the game. But in this sense, it's more for the love of the creation. I dig this thing, and I enjoy the amount of work we put into it to create it. This is a bunch of creative people you're working with. I mean, I found it intriguing. It gets your creative juices going.
Yeah. So would it ever be considered for a retail release? Do you think the developers could ever adapt it so that it could work in a home environment?
I'm not the best person to answer that question because from a technical standpoint, I don't know. I do think it would involve trade-offs. So you might get something in exchange for what you lost, right? So maybe a home version has this element that you couldn't do very well, or maybe a customizable thing that you wouldn't. Remember I told you earlier that there's a problem meeting the sweet spot between a level of intensity I can handle and maybe a level of intensity my daughter can handle. It might be fun to give you the ability to control the intensity level somewhat, and maybe a home version provides that in exchange for the fact that you're losing Skywalker's giant floor speakers, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know the answer to that question, but there have been discussions about trade-offs.
Yeah. And so when people are going through this experience, are they listening to your voice? Are you narrating the full thing? Or is it just kind of an intro and outro? Like, do you ever worry that your voice is going to kind of eat into that experience for people?
That's exactly what happened, where we were working on it early on and trying to figure out how you could. I mean, there was a lot of interest in having me narrate this thing. I would have been fine with no narration at all, but they wanted me to sort of guide people through it. But then you'd be in this immersive scene, and then all of a sudden my voice would break in, and we tried all different kinds of experiments to try to figure out some sort of scenario-based way that would make sense, right? Maybe you're a time traveler and you have a headset on, and I'm your guide through the headset, but nothing worked as well as trying to figure out logical spaces during the experience where it wouldn't take you out of the experience to all of a sudden hear me chiming in explaining something. So the answer turns out to be that there are spots in this experience where having a voice doesn't detract from the visceral nature of it, and there are spots where it does. And in the spots where it does, my voice isn't going to be speaking to you.
Gotcha. Hey, at this point in your career, do you like the sound of your own voice?
No, I've never liked the sound of my own voice.
Is that
but
right?
I don't know anyone who does.
I think some weirdos are out there.
My kids were just saying this to me the other day, how they can't stand the way their voice sounds in a recorded form, but I think that's normal.
Don't you have to listen to thousands of hours of your own voice just for editing those podcasts down?
Yes, it's awful now that you mention it. I mean, it is, and you know this maybe as a podcaster yourself, that it's one of the downsides of the whole thing. And not only do you have to hear it so often, but your antenna break at some point in the process, and you're not able to listen to it as a new listener would hear it anymore. I imagine the same thing happens to musical artists who have to hear the song over and over and over again, and you lose any ability at all to decide if you like it anymore, or if this minorly tweaked version from the last version is any better. So in answer to your question, yes, and I consider that to be one of the inherent things you have to put up with as part of the creative white space and fun that we get as part of podcasting.
Yeah, definitely. It's got to be bizarre, too, because I'd imagine a lot of people, being so popular, I'd imagine you have a lot of people impersonating you to you. Is that upsetting when they do the quote unquote thing to your face?
No, it only happened to me once that it was freaky, and it was the first time a celebrity did it in a celebrity venue, and I was listening to it, and I was just thinking to myself, and it was long enough ago so that it was really something where you go, is this really happening? And I made my wife listen because it was just so bizarre. But otherwise, no, because they don't usually do it to your face. That might be the best answer. But no, I think it's one of those things where it's a form of flattery, and that's how I look at it.
Yeah. Well, who was the celebrity?
It was Stephen Colbert.
Ooh, what was the venue? Just on the show?
He had a podcast between his when he went off the air on his a cable show, and he started the current show he's on. He did a podcast, and there were a couple of episodes where impersonations of me were involved, and it was surreal, I thought, because I'm a Stephen Colbert fan, so it's very bizarre to even hear those people talking about you, but I consider those to be milestones in the show's development too, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So with War Remains, this entire project, what have you learned along the way? Are there any beats of history that with this new approach to World War I you got to delve into more?
Oh, I learned a ton, and please, it's time to take me off the respirator when I stop learning. But to me, all I see when I see the virtual reality technology now is 1 million other things now I want to do with it.
Ooh.
Right? So for me, these open up new venues of projects that I would like to do. I mean, I'd like to clone myself. I got like 20 podcasts I'd like to do. But I mean, the opportunities are so wonderful out there when you talk about learning and growing. And I mean, it almost sounds like a cliche, but at 53 years old, I still get a kick out of all that stuff. And to have these new technologies to play with, I sometimes don't understand the underlying mechanisms of them, but I certainly understand things like storytelling and a different way to incorporate people into the storytelling and a different level. I mean, I had a virtual reality guru, one of the big guys in the industry, explain to me how filmmakers one day are going to be able to remake your favorite movies using a VR sort of approach. And then he started explaining to me all of the different ways a director has to incorporate, he was saying, for example, like imagine an Alfred Hitchcock film. And Alfred Hitchcock, when he wants you to see the hidden killer coming down the stairs, he pans the camera over there. But if you remake that movie in VR, you have to figure out a way to simply detract the listener. Maybe they hear a creak, so in other words, all the little things that this new venue and medium requires you to do to achieve the same results is just a new way to tweak storytelling. And so I find that not only do I find it fascinating, but I find that I learned something about the process of storytelling that I can take back to my podcasting venue or any place else that I'm doing it. So I hope that it's connecting strands in my head of different sorts of mediums and helping me sort of, I don't know, get a synergy between them, if you will.
Yeah, I can dig it. So if you ever made another VR project or just straight up video game, is there an era you'd like to set it in? Is there like an underappreciated period of history you'd like to get more eyeballs on?
Oh, man, I haven't thought about that because I haven't narrowed it down. For me, there are always things that I'm less likely to do. I mean, we were joking during the making of this that, how come I'm never showing you just a nice picnic in some wonderful country 400 or 500 years ago, where you could appreciate that for most people, most of the time, life is pretty good. And I don't know the answer to that. So I know it's not going to be a sedate sort of scene somewhere. That's none of the things I'm considering fall into that category. So through my lens, it's always going to be a little bit more extreme than it probably was to live through. Okay. Unless you just happen to hit the sweet spot like a trench in World War I on the Western Front.
Yeah, for sure, man. Hey, here's a weird question for you. How are you at preserving your own history? Which might sound highfalutin, but like when you're digging through and you always find some great personal letters from the past to read on hardcore history, stuff like that. It's like, do you feel like you're writing the type of content that you hope people hundreds of years from now will want to read?
I think about that in a sort of a slightly different, not to change the subject, but you've hit upon something that I actually think about, but not so much in the personal sense, because I'll go back and look back at, say, ancient history, and you realize you don't even have a solid idea of what any of these famous people, Alexander the Great, sort of my default go-to for anything like this. So let's just say Alexander the Great. You don't even have a really good sense what that guy looked like. Now, imagine instead of being able to go back 2,400 years and not even have a photograph of the guy, people 2,500 years from now are going to have podcasts from these people, and moving pictures and maybe even a virtual reality. I mean, imagine what happens when virtual reality becomes something that you could record for yourself. So in other words, you're going through a scene right now, one of your life experiences that you never want to forget, your kid's first day at school, and you click on your version of an iPhone 15 years from now, and instead of recording a movie of it, it records a three-dimensional virtual reality copy of the scene that you could then go back and relive for years, right?
Yeah.
So when I think about it, I don't think about it so specifically for me as, oh my goodness, all these podcast people are doing today are going to be mined by the historians of the future, and they're going to know so much more about us than we know about anybody in the past, because we're creating the digital records for them to mine in the future right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's how I think about it.
No, I'm totally with you. It's just so frustrating, going back to the earliest writing and people are just listing inventory of items and stuff. And it's like, what? Can't you just spend 1 minute just writing out how you're feeling, what you're worried about today, like that type of stuff, Your
daily diary. I mean, who wouldn't love a daily diary from some average person in the Bronze Age? I mean, how wonderful. What's crazy to me is knowing people the way we do. It's strange that they didn't. Right. Or you might say, I mean, maybe they did and we just don't have it. But theoretically, you would think that people have a need to write that kind of stuff down. And so, I mean, in a sense, maybe it's weirder that we don't have it than we do, kind of thing.
Yeah. It's like, were they expressing that just so much in person or just...
Yeah, was it conversational instead?
Yeah, but you would think like this conversation's so good, we're going to chisel this entire thing into the rock wall, no matter what.
Or even like leaving a message for your kids or
Yeah.
anything like that, or family history and again, we have to assume that a lot of stuff existed that didn't survive. I mean, the Romans famously had things like ancestor walls, right? Which I think Game of Thrones kind of lifted that concept too, where you have like wax faces, death masks or life masks of your ancestors with a little biography underneath it saying this was this person. He's your great-great-grandfather. He achieved this. He lived from this time. They didn't have dates the way we do. But, so, I mean, what passed for that? So I'm with you. I mean, I think in terms of my personal history, I do a pretty good job with family history. It's a lot worse when we talk about my personal history. I've often thought, I have a friend of mine who's doing like an autobiography now. He's trying to sort of recreate his life in some sort of written form. And until you actually sit down and start the task, I imagine you don't even think about all the things in your life that you would catalog until you kind of have to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Wait, is that going to be the final episode of Hardcore History? Is just your own autobiography? That'd be really cool.
Would it? Okay, I'll remember that.
Yeah, please write that down.
I have at least one show idea in the can.
Cool. Well, hey, if people want to check out War Remains, where should they go? What should they do here?
Warremains.com is the website. Because it's a destination, it's in location. So we were at the Tribeca Film Festival, and that was a stripped down version because you didn't have the lead-in room and the post-op room kind of thing. At Austin, it's debuting in Austin, be in September, late August, and it is going to be it's going to have the full experience. I hope I got those dates right. I might not have, because I'm going to be there in about a week to kick off some of the press stuff. So that's the first one. Tickets are on sale for the first block of tickets right now. And then we're going to move sort of based on demand and opportunities and places that look like good fits for us.
Awesome. That sounds great. Well, hey, Dan Carlin, thanks for your time today, man. Really appreciate it.
Hey, listen, thanks for having me. I enjoyed myself, and I like these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And hey, thanks for your hard work on the podcast. I know those things must be just gargantuan to put together. So thanks for all the hard work throughout the years, man.
I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. That was just a clip from a larger show called The Game Informer Show. You can find it on iTunes, Google Play, or GameInformer.com. We take the fun opportunities and exclusive information from Game Informer magazine and boil it into a show that airs every Thursday with exclusive cover story information, developer interviews, a lot of fun stuff. So come love games with us.